Hi there, Year 7 and Year 8. This is Mr. Palmer. I'll be doing your distance learning for the rest of Term 6, and our scheme of learning for this term is called Discussing Writers' Aims. And for Lesson 1, we're going to be looking at a story called Lamb to the Slaughter, and today's lesson is going to be focused on reading and comprehension. It's going to be in 3 parts, and this is part 1 called The Incident. So this is for week beginning Monday the 15th of June 2020. Now, our scheme of learning is called Discussing Writers' Aims. Our big question for the term is, how do writers create memorable characters and situations? And our learning skill path we're looking at are path 1 for writers' aims and path 1 for reading skills. And for a challenge, for some of you, we're going to be looking at a bit of vocabulary for learning path skill 3. And because there's 2 years, I've put this onto 2 slides. So if you're year 7 and you want to have a look at your relevant skills, please pause here. And if you're year 8, you can have a pause here and look at those skills for you. And today we are going to be concentrating on our reading skills because we're going to be reading a story and you're going to be answering some questions on that story. Now, there'll be attached to your homework a copy of the story. If you're able to print that off, that'll be helpful, but also we'll have the words displayed on the screen here and I'll be reading it out with you. So there'll be 2 ways that you can access the story. If you do choose to read it, please bear in mind that at the end of each video there's a series of questions that need answering and they'll be answered at the start of the next video. Now, vocabulary we're going to be doing a bit differently this term. We're doing 2 words per week rather than all of them at once. But all of the words and the definitions are going to be on your knowledge organizer. And for year 8, you didn't do this last term, but year 7 have been quite used to this by now. Each word is going to be displayed in all available NAVA classes: noun, adjective, verb, adverb. And the definition is for the top one of those. So if it's the noun is there, there'll be a definition for the noun, whichever is top there. And a reminder here, if you need to pause there to remember what nouns, adjectives, verbs and adverbs are, that will also be on your knowledge organizer. But you can pause if you want. And for each word, it's going to be over 2 slides. So on slide 1, I want you to write down all of the classes of the word. Make sure you check that spelling. I want you to repeat the words aloud after I say them. And I want you to write that definition down. And if possible, try and use your own words. And on slide 2, I'm going to give you an example sentence. You don't need to write that down, but I want you to write your own example sentence. And if you need to, there's a sentence starter that you can use, but you need to use the word in that sentence. So our first word is suspicion. So say that after me. Suspicion. 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 So the noun is suspicion. The adjective is suspicious. The verb is to suspect. And the adverb is suspiciously. And our definition for the noun is a feeling or thought that something bad is very likely. So if you pause there to write those down. And here we have my example sentence. I had a strong suspicion that the biscuit tin would be empty by the time I got home. And for your own prompt question there, I want you to think about when you've had a suspicion about something and just to explain when that was. So what did you have a suspicion about and when was that? Maybe you could put why in there as well. And a challenge is to try and write your answer using the adjective suspicious, the verb to suspect, and the adverb suspiciously. And that might go over more than one sentence. So pause there and complete that work, please. And then we'll move on to our second word for the day, which is alibi. So let's say that together. Alibi. 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 And an alibi is proof that it was not possible for a person to have committed a crime. And it doesn't have any other forms. So it's just the noun form. Pause there. And we'll go to use that in a sentence. So he was able to provide an alibi because he was in class at the time of the incident in the playground. He was able to provide an alibi because he was in class at the time of the incident in the playground. Now, if you imagine that situation, whatever the incident was, if someone was looking for a culprit and they might have said to this boy, or even the teacher, I guess, were you the person who did that? And they'd be able to say, no, I was in the class, and other people would be able to say, yes, they were in the class. So an alibi is proof you didn't do something. So I want you to complete the following statement, including a believable alibi. I couldn't possibly have filled everyone's shoes with sand, officer. My alibi is... So what reason would you have that you could prove that you didn't fill everybody's shoes with sand? And as a challenge, maybe you could think of more than one alibi. I'll let you pause there. And now we'll move on. So a bit of background here to our story. It's called Lamb to the Slaughter. And just some interesting sort of background here. The phrase comes from the King James Bible, which was the first time the Bible was translated into English. It means a person acting in a way that is unconcerned and unaware of an impending catastrophe. So if you imagine quite literally a bunch of lambs, a bunch of sheep being taken to a slaughterhouse, they have no idea what's going to happen to them. They just follow the line. So a person being described as a lamb to the slaughter is unaware of what's about to happen to them. And there's a little interesting side note here, and if people are interested, they could have a look and do some research on this. The King James Bible introduced 257, more than that in fact, phrases into the English language, which is even more than Shakespeare. People often talk about how many phrases Shakespeare introduced. But for example, things like turn the world upside down, the powers that be, no peace for the wicked, a fly in the ointment, the blind leading the blind, all these come from the first official translation of the Bible into English in the early 17th century. So the main thing you need to take from this page, you don't need to write this down, is that a lamb to the slaughter is a person who's unconcerned and unaware of an impending catastrophe. So I want you to do a little prediction there. I've told you what the word means, what the phrase means. What do you think the story might be about based on the title? I want you to write at least 2 sentences. There's 2 sentence starters there. Obviously, Roald Dahl is the writer of the story. Might give you some clues if you know a lot about Roald Dahl. And the story is called Lamb to the Slaughter. So pause there and let yourself write down some predictions. Thank you. And we'll get on with the story. The room was warm and clean, the curtains drawn, the 2 table lamps alight, hers and the one by the empty chair opposite. On the sideboard behind her, 2 tall glasses, soda water, whiskey, fresh ice cubes in the thermos bucket. Mary Maloney was waiting for her husband to come home from work. Now and again, she would glance up at the clock, but without anxiety, merely to please herself with the thought that each minute gone by made it nearer the time when he would come. There was a slow, smiling air about her, and about everything she did. The drop of her head as she bent over her sewing was curiously tranquil. Her skin, for this was her 6th month with child, had acquired a wonderful translucent quality. The mouth was soft, and the eyes, with their new placid look, seemed larger and darker than before. When the clock said 10 minutes to 5, she began to listen, and a few moments later, punctually as always, she heard the tyres on the gravel outside, and the car door slamming, the footsteps passing the window, the key turning in the lock. She laid aside her sewing, stood up, and went forward to kiss him as he came in. "Hello, darling," she said. "Hello, darling," he answered. She took his coat and hung it in the closet. Then she walked over and made the drinks, a strongish one for him, a weak one for herself. And soon she was back again in her chair, with the sewing, and he in the other, opposite, holding the tall glass with both hands, rocking it so the ice cubes tinkled against the side. For her, this was always a blissful time of day. She knew he didn't want to speak much until the first drink was finished, and she, on her side, was content to sit quietly, enjoying his company after the long hours alone in the house. She loved to luxuriate in the presence of this man, and to feel almost as a sunbather feels in the sun, that warm male glow that came out of him to her when they were alone together. She loved him for the way he sat loosely in a chair, for the way he came in a door or moved slowly across the room with long strides. She loved the intent, far look in his eyes when they rested on her, the funny shape of the mouth, and especially the way he remained silent about his tiredness, sitting still with himself until the whisky had taken some of it away. "Tired, darling?" "Yes," he said, "I'm tired." And as he spoke, he did an unusual thing. He lifted his glass and drained it in one swallow, although there was still half of it, at least half of it left. She wasn't really watching him, but she knew what he had done because she heard the ice cubes falling back against the bottom of the empty glass when he lowered his arm. He paused a moment, leaning forward in the chair. Then he got up and went slowly over to fetch himself another. "I'll get it," she cried, jumping up. "Sit down," he said. When he came back, she noticed that the new drink was dark amber with the quantity of whisky in it. "Darling, should I get your slippers?" "No." She watched him as he began to sip the dark yellow drink, and she could see little oily swirls in the liquid because it was so strong. "I think it's a shame," she said, "that when a policeman gets to be as senior as you, they keep him walking about on his feet all day long." He didn't answer, so she bent her head again and went on with her sewing. But each time he lifted the drink to his lips, she heard the ice cubes clinking against the side of the glass. "Darling," she said, "would you like me to get you some cheese? I haven't made any supper because it's Thursday." "No," he said. "If you're too tired to eat out," she went on, "it's still not too late. There's plenty of meat and stuff in the freezer, and you can have it right here and not even move out of the chair." Her eyes waited on him for an answer, a smile, a little nod, but he gave no sign. "Anyway," she went on, "I'll get you some cheese and crackers first." "I don't want it," he said. She moved uneasily in her chair, the large eyes still watching his face. "But you must eat. I'll fix it anyway, and then you can have it or not, as you like." She stood up and placed her sewing on the table by the lamp. "Sit down," he said. "Just for a minute. Sit down." It wasn't till then that she began to get frightened. "Go on," he said. "Sit down." She lowered herself back slowly into the chair, watching him all the time with those large, bewildered eyes. He had finished the second drink and was staring down into the glass, frowning. "Listen," he said. "I've got something to tell you." "What is it, darling? What's the matter?" He had now become absolutely motionless, and he kept his head down so that the light from the lamp beside him fell across the upper part of his face, leaving the chin and mouth in shadow. She noticed there was a little muscle moving near the corner of his left eye. "This is going to be a bit of a shock to you, I'm afraid," he said, "but I've thought about it a good deal, and I've decided the only thing to do is tell you right away. I hope you won't blame me too much." And he told her. It didn't take long, 4 or 5 minutes at the most, and she sat very still through it all, watching him with a kind of dazed horror as he went further and further away from her with each word. "So there it is," he added. "And I know it's kind of bad timing for me to be telling you, but there simply wasn't any other way. Of course I'll give you money and see you're looked after, but there needn't be any fuss. I hope not anyway. It wouldn't be very good for my job." Her first instinct was not to believe any of it, to reject it all. It occurred to her that perhaps he hadn't even spoken, that she herself had imagined the whole thing. Maybe, if she went about her business and acted as though she hadn't been listening, then later, when she sort of woke up again, she might find none of it had ever happened. "I'll get the supper," she managed to whisper, and this time he didn't stop her. When she walked across the room, she couldn't feel her feet touching the floor. She couldn't feel anything at all, except a slight nausea and a desire to vomit. Everything was automatic now, down the steps into the cellar, the light switch, the deep freeze, the hand inside the cabinet taking hold of the first object it met. She lifted it out and looked at it. It was wrapped in paper, so she took off the paper and looked at it again. A leg of lamb. All right then. They would have lamb for supper. She carried it upstairs, holding the thin bone end of it with both her hands, and as she went through the living room, she saw him standing over by the window with his back to her, and she stopped. "For God's sake," he said, hearing her but not turning round, "don't make supper for me. I'm going out." At that point, Mary Maloney simply walked up behind him, and without any pause, she swung the big frozen leg of lamb high in the air and brought it down as hard as she could on the back of his head. She might as well have hit him with a steel club. She stepped back a pace, waiting, and the funny thing was that he remained standing there for at least 4 or 5 seconds, gently swaying. Then he crashed to the carpet. The violence of the crash, the noise, the small table overturning, helped bring her out of her shock. She came out slowly, feeling cold and surprised, and she stood for a while blinking at the body, still holding the ridiculous piece of meat tight with both hands. All right, she told herself. So I've killed him. So that was the first part of the story. And just to check our understanding here, I'm going to ask you to complete these 8 questions, to answer these questions. So number 1, what is the name of the main character? Number 2, the description of her reveals something about her. What is that? Number 3, what drink does she prepare for her husband? Number 4, what is unusual about the way her husband drank his drink? Number 5, what job does her husband do? Number 6, what does he tell her? Number 7, what is she planning to make for supper? Number 8, what does she do with it instead of cooking it? So going to let you pause there and answer those questions. And in fact, that's the end of the first part. So once you've answered those questions, you can start the second video and I'll catch up with you then.